In this video, I'm going to work on getting my two spokeshaves in better shape. Both of these I inherited from my grandfather when he passed away a few years ago. I've used both of them quite a lot, but I've never really shown them much love or attention, so today's the day. This first one is the more traditional of the two. It's made up of just two parts, the wooden handle and the blade, and you can adjust the height of the blade by tapping these pins with a hammer, and the pins are just a friction fit inside the wooden body. So it's quite primitive, but it works really well. And the second one has a metal body. It says on the underside number A151. I'm going to start with this one first because I suspect this one will be the easier of the two. And the first thing I need to do is remove the cap iron. I donned a pair of gloves for this as it was about to get messy. I'd start the cleaning process with some 80 grit abrasive paper and some 220 grit wet and dry paper stuck to a melamine board with some sticky back tape. I started cleaning up the top of the cap iron first, and underneath the rust I eventually revealed that it was made by Record, which was a pleasant surprise. So here I'm removing the rust. I'm not aiming to make this look new like it just came out of the factory. I actually like my tools to look like they've had some use. Next I worked on the front bevel of the cap iron, so I'm just gradually changing the angle against the abrasive paper until all of the rust was gone. Then I did the back of the cap iron. I sprayed some water with a drop of washing up liquid in it for lubrication onto the 220 grit wet and dry paper, and then repeated the process just to polish up the metal some more. I also needed to clean the edges, so I did that by hand, and that was the cap iron done. The cutting iron was very rusty, so I gave that some 80 grit action too. You can see here that I was only hitting the edges with the sandpaper as there was quite a big hollow in the centre, but at the tip it was nice and flat, and that's all I really wanted, so rather than spending ages getting the back of the blade perfectly flat for no good reason, I just cleaned up the centre where the hollow was by hand. And for the second surprise under all that rust, this cutting iron is actually made by Stanley, so it's a Stanley cutting iron and a Record cap iron. I'm not sure if the body of the spokeshave is a Record or a Stanley. It could be something else entirely. Then I cleaned up the top of the cutting iron. After polishing at 220 grit, this is how it looked. The cutting edge on this was really blunt, and to demonstrate that I tried it on some paper, and as you can see it doesn't really cut at all at the moment. To sharpen it, I'd start with my 360 and 600 grit double-sided diamond plate. I'll leave links in the description box below this video to all of the products that I use for sharpening. All of them are relatively inexpensive. I sprayed on some water and started to clean up the back first at 360 and then 600 grit. Next I'd use my whetstone, which I'd already soaked in some water for a few minutes before. This is 1000 grit on one side and 6000 grit on the other. And I love this stone because it cuts through the metal really quickly, as you can see by the grey slurry. After using the 1000 side, I moved on to the 6000 side, and this gets the metal really shiny, almost mirror-like. Usually for sharpening a cutting edge, I use a honing guide. This helps to maintain a consistent bevel angle while you're sharpening, but the spokeshave blade is too small for that, so I needed to do it by hand, and to be honest I've not had much practice at that, but it is something that I want to get good at. So I started by finding the bevel on the diamond plate, making a few passes, and then this happened. Not good at all. At this point I realised if I held the cutting iron at roughly a 45-degree angle onto the diamond plate or whetstone, there was much less chance of me repeating that mistake again and damaging my cutting edge, and that method worked much better. After a while I could feel a burr along the length of the cutting edge, which is a good sign. I'm not quite sure if I captured it on camera at this point, but you'll see it later on when I remove it from the blade. So now that the burr was established, I moved up through the grits, 600, 1000 and then 6000. The great thing about having both a diamond plate and a whetstone is that you can flatten the whetstone on the diamond plate, as the whetstone is much softer than the diamond plate. Finally, I used my strop. This is a piece of leather which I salvaged from a sofa, glued onto a block of MDF, with the finished side of the leather glued to the block, so what you're seeing here is the back of the leather. I charged the strop with some green polishing compound. I first removed the burr from the back of the blade, and here's a small piece of it. I polished the cutting edge and got a really nice mirror finish. At this point I could do all of the YouTube sharpening cliches like shaving my arm hair off and slicing paper. To protect all of the bare metal parts on the spokeshave, I'd use this. It's a piece of cloth soaked in 3-in-1 oil, stuffed tightly into a plastic lid. This is something I learned from a Paul Sellers YouTube video, although in his video he uses a tomato can. So I rubbed that on the cutting iron and the cap iron too. The sole of the spokeshave also needed some cleaning up. I did that on the diamond plates, again at 360 and then 600 grit. I didn't bother going any higher as it wasn't really necessary. Then I oiled up all of the other parts, including the screw threads. I put the spokeshave back together so I could try it out. I started with pine and it worked really well. Then I moved on to some oak and it had no trouble with that either. It cut nice and cleanly. Then I remembered that I had some metal paint left over from when I restored my vise, so I thought I'd take this cleanup a bit further. I removed all the metal parts from the body again and sanded it down. I wasn't aiming to get down to bare metal here, just to roughen up the surface so that the new paint would adhere. I cleaned off the dust with some white spirit, and then dried it with a paper towel. And then I applied the paint. I gave it 2 coats as this paint covers really well. For the second spokeshave, I first removed the blade, and it was quite rusty. I flattened the back of the cutting iron, working up through the grits as I had for the first spokeshave. Then I could start working on the cutting edge, but for this I couldn't sharpen it on the diamond plates or whetstone because of the pins being in the way, so instead I used a method I'd seen in a Paul Sellers video on YouTube. I stuck some sticky back tape onto a piece of pine and then added some 240 grit wet and dry paper. I made some marks with a Sharpie onto the cutting edge and then added a block into my vise which the blade would rest on. I then did some sharpening and I could see that the marker pen was being removed from the very tip of the cutting edge, which was what I wanted. As you can see, with one end of the stick referencing on the surface of the workbench and the other end on the cutting edge, a consistent angle is maintained while sharpening. Then I added some 400 grit paper onto the other end of the stick and polished the cutting edge some more. The great thing about this method is that it's adjustable via the block in the vise, so you can get the exact height you need to hit the cutting edge. Here I'm using another stick with some 1200 grit attached. Finally, I added some polishing compound to the other side so that I could polish the edges even more. After oiling the cutting iron to give it some protection, I could refit the blade and set the cutting depth. And as you can see, this one worked really well too. As I'd given the first Spokeshave a new coat of paint, I didn't want this one to feel left out. So I sanded the body at 80 and then 120 grit and gave it a nice fresh coat of boiled linseed oil.